In the winter of 1259, Polish peasants found something unusual in their fields. Mongol scouts frozen to death on their horses, both man and beast, standing upright like ice sculptures, their eyes pecked out by ravens. The locals didn't bury them. Instead, they set up market stalls around the frozen corpses, selling hot soup while using the dead Mongols as macabre decorations. Children threw snowballs at them, dogs pissed on them. One enterprising merchant hung a sign from a frozen Mongol's outstretched arm advertising fresh bread, not made from human flesh like Mongol food. This wasn't fear anymore. This was contempt. For 20 years, Europe had nightmares about the Mongols. But now they'd become carnival attractions. They remembered Lenica, where Mongol warriors filled 9 sacks with European ears. They remembered the drinking cups made from children's skulls. They remembered 100 zero knights slaughtered in 3 days, their armor useless as paper against Mongol arrows. They remembered cities where the only survivors were the cats, because even the rats had been eaten by starving refugees. But in 1259, when the Golden Horde returned to Poland expecting another feast of conquest, they found something they'd never encountered before, an enemy that had learned from its nightmares. The Mongols were about to discover what happens when you teach peaceful farmers how to be monsters. They'd created their own executioners. The Mongol war machine depended entirely on their horses. Each warrior traveled with 5 to 10 mounts, rotating them to maintain speed, drinking their blood for sustenance, using their hides for armor, their bones for arrows. A Mongol without horses wasn't a warrior. He was just a man in fur clothing very far from home. The Poles under Duke Bolesław the Chase Steed, a name that would soon be ironic given what he'd do to Mongol prisoners, had spent 2 decades studying their enemy's greatest weakness. 3 months before the invasion, Polish forces began the most extensive scorched earth campaign in medieval history, poisoning wells with rotting corpses, burning every blade of grass for 50 m, salting, grazing lands with lime and arsenic. Most diabolically, they left behind gift horses, beautiful Polish mares infected with glanders, a disease that spreads through horse populations like wildfire, causing pus-filled abscesses in lungs until the animals drown in their own fluids. When Mongol General Noi Keichen crossed the Vistula River in December 1259 with 30,000 riders, his scouts reported something disturbing. The land ahead was dead, not conquered, not abandoned, dead. Every village was empty. Every field was black ash. Every well had bloated horse corpses floating in it. The Polish population had vanished like smoke, taking every grain of wheat with them. They'd even dug up their graveyards and taken the bones, denying the Mongols even the possibility of grinding skeletal remains for calcium. By the second week, the gift horses started showing symptoms. Mongol horses began coughing blood, their necks swelling with abscesses that burst and spread infection through contact. The Mongols, not understanding disease transmission, moved sick horses to the rear with healthy reserves, spreading glanders throughout their entire herd. Within 3 weeks, horses were dying by the hundreds daily, their bodies left behind in a trail of death that wolves followed like a moving feast. Then the Polish ghosts began their work. Duke Bolesław had recruited not knights but peasants, men who knew the forests, who could move silently in winter, who had spent 20 years dreaming of revenge for murdered families. These weren't soldiers, they were hunters, and they'd been given simple instructions. Kill Mongols like you would kill wolves. No honor, no mercy, just death. The tactics were devastating in their simplicity. Polish raiders would wait for Mongol scouting parties to make camp, then attack during the deepest sleep hours before dawn. But they didn't fight. They simply cut horse throats and vanished into the forest. A Mongol warrior might wake to find his 5 horses dead, their blood turning the snow into red slush, and no enemy in sight. Without horses in enemy territory in winter, he was already dead. It just took a few days of walking through frozen forests for him to realize it. One Mongol unit of 500 men woke to find every single horse's throat cut, the animals arranged in a circle around their camp like a grotesque warning. The Poles had done it so silently that not even the sentries had noticed. The message was clear: we can kill you whenever we want. The psychological impact was devastating. Mongol warriors who'd conquered from China to Hungary found themselves afraid to sleep. They knew Mongols traveled light, depending on raid and forage for supplies. So the Poles began leaving abandoned supply caches, barrels of mead, sacks of grain, preserved meats, all poisoned with hemlock and wolfsbane, but not enough to kill immediately. Just enough to cause agonizing stomach cramps and bloody diarrhea. One Mongol captain, Bidar, wrote in his dispatch to Nogai Khan, "The enemy is nowhere and everywhere. We conquer empty villages and rule over ghosts. My men, blood and sea demons, the horses, eat each other's manes from hunger. This land is cursed." By January 1260, the situation was desperate. Mongol horses, those that survived the disease, were eating bark from trees, their own dung, and eventually each other. Warriors who'd once drunk mare's milk and horse blood now watched their mounts collapse from starvation. Too weak even to be slaughtered for meat, the Polish strategy was working perfectly. They turned Poland into a desert that consumed armies. Then came Sandom, where the trap finally snapped shut. Duke Bolesław had been retreating for weeks, always just out of reach, leaving poisoned supplies and dead land behind. The Mongols, now down to perhaps 15,000 effective warriors from their original 30,000, pursued him towards Sanders on the Vistula River. They thought they had him cornered. They were wrong. The Duke had spent 2 months preparing something special, a killing field designed specifically for Mongols. The Battle of Sanders was not a battle. It was a slaughter wearing the mask of a battle. The Mongols approached the city to find the Polish army arranged in traditional formation. Knights in front, infantry behind, banners flying. It looked like the kind of formal European battle the Mongols had crushed 100 times. No, Khan ordered traditional tactics, feigned retreat to draw the knights out, then shower them with arrows. But when the Mongol light cavalry began their feigned retreat, something unprecedented happened. The Polish knights didn't follow. They just stood there, shields up, waiting. The Mongols wheeled around for their arrow assault and discovered why. Their horses, already weakened, couldn't gallop in the deep trenches hidden under a thin layer of snow and branches. Horses broke their legs by the dozens, throwing riders into concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes smeared with human feces, ensuring any wound would become septic. The trap had been perfectly designed to counter every Mongol advantage. As the Mongol cavalry floundered in the trap field, Polish crossbowmen emerged from concealed positions. But they weren't aiming at the warriors. They shot the horses. Every single horse methodically, efficiently, like farmers culling diseased cattle. The Mongols, watching their mounts die, realized they were now infantry in enemy territory in winter, hundreds of miles from any support. Then the peasants arrived, thousands of them armed not with swords but with farming implements, flails for grain, hooks for hay, hammers for horseshoes. They'd been promised something extraordinary by Duke Bolesław, 1 silver penny for every Mongoler, 2 pennies for a thumb, and a gold ducat for a Mongol commander's head. What followed was less combat than harvesting. The Mongol warriors, trained from childhood for mounted warfare, tried to form defensive circles on foot. But they were exhausted, many still suffering from poisoning, wearing armor designed for horseback, not ground combat. The peasants swarmed them like ants on dying beetles. They used harvest scythes to cut tendons, grain flails to crush skulls, and pruning hooks to drag warriors down into the mud, where they could be dealt with using hammers and stones. One Polish chronicler described it: "The Tartars died not like warriors, but like sheep in slaughter season. Our peasants worked in teams, turning killing into a craft like threshing wheat." The harvest, as it became known, lasted 3 hours. Some peasants, being practical, cut off both ears despite the single payment rule, figuring they could sell the extra ones to less successful hunters. Others collected Mongol fingers to make necklaces that they'd sell to merchants as protection charms. The Mongol commanders, identified by their silk undershirts and gold ornaments, were kept alive. Briefly, just long enough for peasants to negotiate who got to claim the head bounty. Then they were beheaded with the same axes used to slaughter pigs, the screams mixed with peasant work songs. It was the harvest they'd waited 20 years for, and they sang while they reaped. No Khan himself survived, but only because Duke Balswees wanted him to. The Duke had something special planned. The Mongol general was stripped naked, painted with pig blood, and forced to ride a donkey backward through 20 Polish villages, while peasants threw dung and rotten vegetables. In each village, the locals were allowed to cut off one small piece of him, a finger joint, a piece of ear, a toe, but not enough to kill him. By the time he reached the final village, he was missing numerous small parts and begging for death. Instead, they castrated him with sheep shears and sent him back to the Golden Horde as a message. This is what Europe does to invaders now. Meanwhile, at Kresen-Brunn in Austria, King Otto Roman II of Bohemia was conducting his own extermination campaign. The Battle of Kresen-Brunn in July 1260 was different from Sanders. This was heavily armored knights against Mongol cavalry in open field, but the Bohemians had learned from 20 years of defeat. They developed new tactics specifically for Mongols. Instead of charging, they formed hollow squares bristling with pikes like mobile fortresses. Swiss mercenaries with crossbows stood inside, creating kill zones that horses couldn't enter. When Mongol arrows bounced off improved plate armor, when their cavalry charges impaled themselves on pike walls, the Mongols realized their traditional tactics were obsolete. The Bohemian heavy cavalry held in reserve waited until the Mongol horses were exhausted from futile charges. Then they attacked. These weren't the old-style knights who'd been slaughtered at Elnica. These wore full-plate armor that Mongol arrows couldn't penetrate, rode massive destrias that trampled Mongol ponies, and wielded warhammers designed specifically to crush through Mongol lamela armor. The killing at Kresen-Brunn was so thorough that Otter ordered his men to stop taking ears. There were too many to count. Instead, they just piled Mongol heads into pyramids along the main trade route from Vienna to Prague. Over 50 pyramid markers, each containing between 100 and 300 heads, but the most horrifying fate awaited Mongol stragglers who fled into the Carpathian Mountains. Winter in the Carpathians is brutal, even with supplies. The Mongol survivors, perhaps 3-0 men who'd escaped slaughters, found themselves trapped in mountain passes with no food, no horses, and temperatures dropping to -30 degrees. Polish and Hungarian mountain villages had been warned they were coming. Villagers blocked passes with fallen trees, destroyed bridges, and then waited. Starvation in mountains follows a predictable pattern. First the leather, belts, boots, saddles, then the frozen horse carcasses, then bark, pine needles, and finally by week 4, each other. A Hungarian patrol found a Mongol camp where the occupants had clearly turned on each other. Bodies were butchered with the same precision Mongols used on sheep. Major muscle groups removed, bones cracked for marrow, even the skin cooked into a sort of crackling. The survivors had established rules. The sick were eaten first, then the wounded, then lots were drawn among the healthy. When Mongol warrior's journal, recovered from his frozen corpse, contained a confession, "We ate Timur yesterday. He was my brother in arms for 6 years. His liver was diseased, black with spots, but we ate it anyway. Tomorrow they will share me. The mountains are full of demons that look like peasants. The mountain villages indeed watched and waited. When Mongol groups became weak enough, peasants would attack with hunting bows and boar spears. But mostly they just waited for winter to do their work. They'd find frozen Mongols in spring, perfectly preserved, their faces twisted in expressions of final agony. The bodies were stripped of anything valuable, weapons, armor, gold, dental work, and left for wolves. Some villages developed a gruesome economy around Mongol corpses. They'd harvest tendons for bowstrings, hair for brushes, and skulls for drinking cups. A bitter reversal of what Mongols had done to Europeans at Lenica. Every household had Mongol skull bowls used specifically for feast days. The few hundred Mongols who made it through the mountains faced a final horror: the slave markets. The Venetians, always pragmatic about profit, had established a robust trade in Mongol prisoners. But these weren't warriors anymore. They were broken, starving, often mutilated survivors who'd eaten human flesh to survive. The Venetians bought them for almost nothing from Hungarian peasants, then sold them to Egyptian Mamluks, who found ironic satisfaction in enslaving the sons of men who'd enslaved half the world. The slave ships were floating hells packed into holes designed for cargo, chained to prevent suicide, fed just enough to keep them alive until sale. Many went mad from the reversal of fortune. Children received different treatment. Mongol boys under 10 were castrated and sold as anak to guard or harems. The survival rate from the crude castration was perhaps 1 in 3. Those who survived were trained to forget they were ever Mongol, raised to serve in the palaces of the very civilizations their fathers had tried to destroy. Mongol girls were sold to brothel across the Mediterranean, marketed specifically as daughters of the conquerors for clients who took sadistic pleasure in dominating the offspring of feared warriors. The Venetian merchant Marco Sanudo recorded, "The Tartars make poor slaves. They refuse to work. They attack their overseers with their teeth like wild dogs, and many hang themselves with their own chains." Back in Poland, Duke Bolesław ordered a special monument built from Mongol bones. At the site of Sanders, Polish peasants constructed a church. Its foundation mortar mixed with ground Mongol bones. Its walls decorated with Mongol skulls, arranged in crosses. Its altar made from a single block of stone where Nogai Kyechen had been castrated. They called it the Church of Divine Vengeance. It stood for 200 years until it was destroyed by embarrassed church officials who thought it unchristian. The immediate military impact was decisive. The Mongol invasion force of 30,000 had been essentially exterminated. Perhaps 500 made it back to the Golden Horde, many missing ears, fingers, or other parts, telling tales of poisoned earth and enemies who fought without honor. But Europe wasn't done teaching lessons. When news of the victories reached other European courts, it triggered what historians call the Mongol Hunt of 1261-1263. Suddenly, every minor lord wanted Mongol heads for their castle walls. Bounty hunters specialized in tracking down Mongol stragglers. The Teutonic Knights sent cleansing parties deep into Eastern Europe to find and exterminate any Mongol camps. These hunts were exercises in creative brutality. The Teutonic Knights would capture Mongol scouts, force them to reveal their camp locations, then used the scouts as living torches, covering them in pitch and setting them ablaze before sending them running back into their own camps. The Hungarian Baron Bela preferred impalement, lining his borders with Mongol warriors on stakes. The Golden Horde made one last attempt at retaliation in 1262. A force of 10,000 riders was sent to raid Poland as punishment. They made it exactly 30 miles past the border before discovering that Polish peasants had developed an early warning system using church bells. Within hours, every village for 50 new Mongols were coming. The earth was scorched ahead of them. Wells were poisoned, and Polish wolf packs of mounted peasants shadowed them constantly. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers who'd learned to fight like Mongols, adopting their hit-and-run tactics, but with crucial knowledge of the land. They'd strike at night, kill scent sentries, steal horses, poison supplies, then vanish into forests the Mongols didn't know. The Mongol commander, Bundai, reported, "We are not fighting an army, but the land itself. Every tree hides an archer. Every stream is poisoned. Every village is empty but watching. My men are afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to drink water. This is not war. It is being slowly digested by a hostile country." After 2 weeks of this psychological torture, the Mongols retreated. As they withdrew, Polish peasants followed, picking off stragglers. The final insult came at the border. Polish children, some as young as 7, stood on hills throwing rocks at the retreating Mongol army, while singing mocking songs about the brave horsemen who ran from farmers. The Mongols, who'd conquered the greatest empires on earth, were being laughed at by children. The Golden Horde never attempted another serious invasion of Central Europe. The transformation was complete. In 1241, Europe had trembled before Mongol horsemen like sheep before wolves. By 1263, European peasants were wearing necklaces of Mongol finger bones and drinking from Mongol skulls, while their children played games called Hunt the Tartar with the captured helmets of dead warriors. The invincible had become the hunted, the conquerors had become commodities in slave markets, and the terror of the steppes had learned to fear the sound of Christian church bells. The myth of Mongol invincibility was dead, killed by farmers with pitchforks who'd learned that the secret to defeating monsters was to become something worse. Stories filtered back along the Silk Road, the great Mongol warriors defeated by European farmers, their generals castrated like sheep, their children sold in markets, their bones ground into mortar for churches. Other peoples who'd submitted to Mongol rule began to wonder if Polish peasants could destroy the invincible Mongol army with poisoned wells and farming tools. What were they so afraid of? Within a generation, the Mongol Empire began its long fragmentation. Yuan dynasty in China would fall. The Ilkhanate in Persia would collapse. The Golden Horde would shrink and divide. The spell was broken when Polish peasants proved that the invincible warriors were just men who could be killed with pitchforks. Today, archaeologists still find mass graves along the Carpathian mountain passes. Mongol warriors who died from starvation and cold, their bones bearing teeth marks indicating cannibalism. In Polish museums, you can see the preserved harvest tools, the modified scythes and flails specifically designed for killing dismounted Mongols, passed down through families as heirlooms. Some rural Polish churches still have foundation stones that, when tested, contain unusual amounts of human calcium, the ground bones of Mongol warriors mixed into mortar. Mongols called their empire the Eternal Blue Sky. No, but they discovered that even the eternal sky ends at the edge of a Polish peasant scythe. They taught Europe how to be monsters, and Europe had learned the lesson too well. The last Mongol to leave Poland alive in 1263 was a young scout named Countess, who'd lost his ears, nose, and fingers to Polish peasants. He made it back to the Golden Horde and lived another 40 years, warning every young warrior about the land of death, where the earth itself was poisoned, and farmers wore necklaces of Mongol bones. He ended every warning the same way. They say we were invincible. We were not. We were just men far from home who learned that teaching sheep to be wolves means one day the sheep will eat you. He was right. The Mongols had created their own executioners. They really should have stayed in the steppes where they belonged instead of teaching peaceful farmers the art of systematic slaughter.